I'm very excited about in this course that I've been talking about, which is called Recreating Ourselves in the Image of the Master. And I want to begin by reading an interesting letter from the Universal House of Justice, 29 August of 2010. You know that right now we're in a period in which we're commemorating the 100th anniversary of Abdu'l-Baha's travels. The Universal House of Justice wrote a letter to the Baha'i world, and they pointed out that this period, this 100th anniversary celebration or commemoration of Abdu'l-Baha's travels, is much more than a commemoration. Quote, "This anniversary is more than a time for commemoration." And they went on to say that if we were to study Abdu'l-Baha's travels, they would give us an abundance of inspiration and manifold insights from which the body of the believers can today draw. So basically the House of Justice is saying 1912, when Abdu'l-Baha traveled, is not just about 1912. Rather, it's about 2012, and it's not just about Abdu'l-Baha, it's about us. And then, just to make it clear, they listed 6 areas which they say if we study Abdu'l-Baha's travels, we can learn something about what we can do today in those 6 areas. The first one they said was in our efforts to embrace receptive souls. Is there anyone here in the room that would like to embrace receptive souls? 1, 2, 3. Okay, so here's the point. Here's the point. The House of Justice says you can learn how to do this by studying Abdu'l-Baha's travels in 1912, 1913. The second one they said was in our efforts to raise capacity for service. Is there anyone here that would like to raise capacity for service, either in themselves or in others? 2, 3, 4, that's good. So, once again, the House of Justice says you can do this by studying Abdu'l-Baha. There's something in the record of Abdu'l-Baha's travels that can teach us how to do this thing that we want to do. The third, they said, was to build local communities. The fourth, they said, was to strengthen institutions. The fifth, they said, to exploit opportunities emerging to engage in social action. The clue to how to do this is in Abdu'l-Baha's record of his journeys. And the sixth, they said, was to contribute to public discourse. In the world today, people are striving, they're struggling to find answers to all kinds of things, and there's a lot of discussion. And we have a lot to contribute, but how can we do that? Through what means can we do that? By what methods can we do that? The House of Justice says you can figure that out by studying Abdu'l-Baha. Abdu'l-Baha is so remarkable because even Baha'u'llah bestowed upon him the name the mystery of God. We don't even realize what he means to us. And it just seems to me that Baha'u'llah wanted to create us anew. He came to make a new race of men. And whenever you want to make anything new, the first thing you do is build a prototype. Because you can't understand something in words alone. If I try to describe something entirely new, it's based on language, and language is based on the past. It's based on what we know and understand. If you want something new, you have to create a prototype. Abdu'l-Baha is God's prototype. He's what we look at and we understand. We hear all these different phrases like forgiveness or courtesy or virtues, but they're just words. And Abdu'l-Baha brings them to life. Shoghi Effendi said that Abdu'l-Baha was the incarnation of every Baha'i virtue and the embodiment of every Baha'i ideal. And so I want to ask you something. When you think of Abdu'l-Baha, what do you think of? What do you think of when you think of Abdu'l-Baha? The only thing you should be thinking of when you think of Abdu'l-Baha is yourself. Every time you see Abdu'l-Baha or you hear a story of him, it should be a challenge to you to do the things that he did. He said something very interesting. He said, "Look at me, follow me, be as I am." A simple 3-phrase, 9-word sentence, and yet it encapsulates 3 processes. 1, to look at him. That's the first stage, to look at him, to study him, to read the stories. And some of us, we think we just want to stay in that first stage because it's so enjoyable to read the stories and to laugh and to enjoy him. But there's a second stage. to follow him. In other words, to copy him, to try and duplicate. But there's even a third stage, be. Being is a much higher stage than even copying. You can blindly copy something without really understanding. So the act of being. So even Abdu'l-Baha, in this simple sentence, lets us know that there is a journey that we must all take on the spiritual path, which starts with looking at him, but then must immediately proceed to copying him, which then proceeds to actually being like him. So when I was asked to prepare a talk on Abdu'l-Baha, I realized that this is not a talk on Abdu'l-Baha, this is a talk about us. And I said, then, what are the qualities of Abdu'l-Baha that he wanted us to learn? And I came to what I call the 6 essential qualities of Abdu'l-Baha. Of all the virtues of Abdu'l-Baha, the incarnation of every Baha'i virtue, of all of those, what do you think I picked first? I picked the one that Abdu'l-Baha seemed most concerned with himself, that he mentioned more often than any other quality, and the one word which came up over and over again in every account I read of Abdu'l-Baha. I picked the quality of happiness. Because every time Abdu'l-Baha met someone, the first thing he wanted to know was, were they happy? And if someone was unhappy, he went to them like a bee, straight at them, and tried to make them happy. And so I had to pick this. In fact, almost every account I read of Abdu'l-Baha said that he was radiantly happy and greeted them with a smile. In fact, he said, if we are not happy and joyous in this season, for what other season shall we wait, and for what other time shall we look? I realized that to Abdu'l-Baha, happiness was not something that you are. Happiness was something that you do. He had a different attitude towards it. Happiness is not something that came to you or didn't come to you based on other circumstances. He told people to be happy, and he helped them to do that. We need to take responsibility for our own happiness. Today we live in a world where people think that if they're unhappy, they're a victim of unhappiness. They need to take a pill, perhaps, to overcome it, or they need to be entertained, or some external force has to come. You know, it's very interesting. When I first came to Los Angeles from Tennessee, people in Tennessee are pretty happy, you know, with a few exceptions, and I'm not going to mention any names, but people in Tennessee are pretty happy. And when I got to Los Angeles, I noticed that every time I met someone in the evening, they would say, "You can't believe what a terrible day I had. Oh, the traffic, it was terrible. Oh, my boss, you can't believe what he said." They would say that. And the other person would say, "Oh, you think you had a bad day." And they would immediately then try and one-up them with their unhappiness. And as I observed this, I realized that the primary mode of human interaction was to share our unhappiness. We felt it totally obliged to tell everybody how bad our day was, how bad our life was, and to share it. And when you talk about things and keep reporting them, they become larger, they become magnified in your mind. In fact, you experience them again. The first thing we need to do if we want to be like Abdu'l-Baha is never unburden other people with our unhappiness. But furthermore, never try to one-up somebody when they're unhappy and say, "Oh, you think..." Abdu'l-Baha, when people said they weren't happy, he didn't say, "Oh, yeah, we'll try living in Akka." You know, he didn't say, "Try the Sea of Shaw." You know, you think you got to. He didn't say that. Okay, no. So that's the first thing we need to do. If we want to live this, we have to live this and not dwell on things. Now, Abdu'l-Baha, if somebody was not happy, this was very important to him. I'll tell you a story about 2 ladies that lived in Scotland, and they heard that Abdu'l-Baha was in London. He was staying at the house of Lady Blomfield. And so they contacted Lady Blomfield and said, "Can we come and visit Abdu'l-Baha?" And she arranged a visit at her house. So they got on the train, they traveled, they went to the house, and Lady Blomfield had arranged a private meeting just with the 2 ladies and Abdu'l-Baha, and this was so special. And so they get into the meeting, and as soon as they get into the meeting, she says that a persistent person pushed past the servers and strode into our midst, Seating himself and lighting a cigarette without invitation, he proceeded to say that he intended writing an article for some paper about Abdu'l-Baha, superciliously asking for some telling points, don't you know? And he talked without pause and far from in a polite manner. She says, we were speechless and aghast at the intrusion of this insufferable and altogether unpleasant bore, spoiling our golden hour. She said, suddenly Abdu'l-Baha rose, and he made a sign to the man to follow him, and they went into his private room. She said, we looked around. The bore had gone. Yes, but alas, so had the master. Can nothing be done? Being the hostess, I was perturbed and perplexed. So I went to the door of the audience room and said to the secretary, will you kindly say to Abdu'l-Baha that the ladies with whom the appointment had been made are awaiting his pleasure? She returned, and they waited, and they waited, and they waited. Finally, they heard steps in the hallway. In the corridor, Abdu'l-Baha was hugging the man and said goodbye. She says, then he came to the room, and closing the door, they said, oh, master. He paused at the door, and he looked at each of us in turn with a deep and grave meaning. You were making that poor man uncomfortable, so strongly desiring his absence, I took him away to make him feel happy. And I'm thinking there's nothing he could have done more in everything he could have said in that meeting that could have taught them more than this, that he desired the happiness of all people. Now, Baha'u'llah said, according to Haji Mirza Haydar Ali, that there were 4 things, 4 qualities that he loved to see in people. 4 qualities. And I'm thinking 4, that's good. Just 4. It's not going to be hard. And so I looked at this list of 4 things, and 3 of them were really hard. And 1 of them wasn't so hard. The first one, he said, was enthusiasm and courage. The second one I'm going to not mention just yet. The third one, he said that we see with our own eyes and not through the eyes of others. This is associated with justice and all kinds, and that's a hard one too, you'd have to agree. The fourth one, he said, was the ability to finish a task once you begin it. 3 of the 4 qualities Baha'u'llah wants us to fulfill. Enthusiasm, courage, seeing with our own eyes and not the eyes of others, and the ability to finish a task once, begun. But the second quality was a face wreathed in smiles and a radiant countenance. Everybody, let's try that right now. A face wreathed, like wreathing is just putting like this complete. Go on, give me your face wreathed in smiles. Go on, give it to me now. Okay. Now, as you're giving it to me now, just think you are doing 1/4 of what Baha'u'llah wants you to do. 25% of everything the Blessed Beauty wants you to do, you're doing right now, just with that. That's the easy one. Okay, I'll do that one at least. Many of you read the writings, I'm sure. How should we read the writings? How should we read the writings? With thoughtfulness. How else should we read the writings? In such a way that won't burden our souls. How else should we read the writings? With glasses. There's no wrong answer here, and that one is... Okay. Let me tell you what Baha'u'llah says. In the Kitab-i-Aqdas, he says to read 1 verse, or even 1 word, in a spirit of joy and radiance is preferable to the perusal of many books. To read 1 word, even. Now I'm thinking, Baha'u'llah, are you sure about this? Over here we got 10 books, and I'm going to read them all. And over here I got 1 word, and I'm reading it with joy and radiance. And you're saying that's preferable? And that's what he's saying in the Aqdas. With joy and radiance. That's how Baha'u'llah says we need to read the writings. Now there's a reason for it, which we're going to find out in a minute. How should we have Baha'i meetings? He says, gather ye together with the utmost joy and fellowship. Yes. So, when we read the writings, we do it with joy and radiance. When we have meetings, we do it with joy. How should we pray? Let's see what Baha'u'llah says in the Kitab-i-Aqdas. Busy thyself in the remembrance of God, and unloose thy tongue in celebrating his praise with utmost joy and radiance. So now, we have to read the writings with joy and radiance. We have to have meetings with joy and radiance. We have to pray with joy and radiance. How should we die? In what way should we die? And don't say detachment, because that's going to happen anyway. Baha'u'llah says, they that are the followers of the one true God shall, the moment they depart out of this life, experience such joy and gladness as would be impossible to describe. So now we got to die with joy and radiance. How should we contribute to the Baha'i funds? In what manner should we contribute to the Baha'i funds? Let's read what Baha'u'llah says. If one spontaneously offereth hukuk with the utmost joy and radiance, it will be acceptable and not otherwise. So, if you give to the hukuk, if you're joyful and radiant, that's great, and he'll accept it. If you're not, don't even bother giving it. How should we go on pilgrimage? Okay, let's read what he says. Thine intention to pay a visit to the blessed house is acceptable and well-pleasing in the sight of this wronged one, provided it is accomplished in a spirit of joy and radiance. It's only acceptable if it's done in... Now, have you noticed that there's two words that are constantly mentioned here in every single passage I read? What are they? Joy and radiance. It's like they're married. It's like they're the Batman and Robin or something of spirituality. They're completely married together. The same two words over and over again, joy and radiance. And as I had to think about this as I came across these passages, because joy is the quality of having happiness within. But radiance is the quality of shedding it to others. It's not enough, apparently, to just be internally happy. What good would the sun be if it had heat and light, but it kept it to itself, if it did not radiate its heat and light? So these two are completely inseparable to Baha'u'llah. Do any of you fast? How do you feel during the fast, let's say an hour before sunset? Let me read you what Baha'u'llah says in the prayer for the fast. These are the days of the fast. Blessed is the one who with joy and radiance arises to perform worthy deeds. So now we've got to fast with joy and radiance. Okay, I might as well just die with joy and radiance. Okay, how should we have holy days? In what manner should we have holy days? With joy and radiance? In fact, he says, rejoice with exceeding gladness, as you call to remember it's the day of supreme felicity when he's talking about Rizwan. In fact, I can't find anything that I can do without joy and radiance. How many of you go to feast? 1, 2, 3. Okay. When you're driving to feast, what are you thinking about as you're driving to feast? Abdu'l-Baha tells you what to think about. He says, as you're going to feast, he says, each one of you must think how to make happy and please the other members. That's our goal. Our goal is to go there and think how. And you have to think how. You don't just try. You just to tickle them or to do a dance. You have to think how to make people happy. He wants you to concentrate on that as you go to feast. Now, I want to ask you, what is happiness? What exactly is happiness? It's difficult, actually, when I think about to even describe. And yet this is the first quality that Abdu'l-Baha wants us to have, that he wants to see in us. The first thing I believe happiness is the willingness and the ability to be happy no matter what happens to you in life. Happiness is not something that comes to you because good things happen to you in life. That's not what it's all about. In other words, people are not happy because of what happens to them in life. It's something else. You're not happy because of those things. Now, I learned this very strongly from the accounts of Abdu'l-Baha's sister, Bahia Khanum, the greatest holy leaf, talking about their imprisonment in Akka. I don't know if you've read some of the heart-wrenching stories of their arrival in Akka. But she said that the boat arrived and it couldn't even dock. They were going to dump all the women right into the water. Abdu'l-Baha quickly arranged for some chairs just so the women could just be carried ashore. But she said they got onto the shore and the guards surrounded them all the way, and all the peoples of the town came to look at them and ridicule them. They were thrown into this tiny little cell, she said. The women were thrown in the cell. There was no furniture. There was no food. The babies were crying. They were starving. Many of the Baha'is died within the first few days. The 72, they were dying within the first few days. And she tells this story. And then she finishes by saying, she says, we were marvelously happy in those barracks. I couldn't believe this. She said, and then she says, the second night we were there, just the second night as they were dying, this is the second night there, we got to laughing so hard that Baha'u'llah came to the door and told us to stop. That he was afraid the guard would think we had gone crazy to be so happy in such a place. Can you believe this quality of accepting whatever happens to you in life? This is the type of happiness. To Abdu'l-Baha, laughter was a very serious business. This is a very important quality, to make people happy and to be happy and to let people know that it's possible to be happy under all conditions, that we are responsible for our own happiness. Now, some of this comes from the teachings of the Bab. In the Kitab-i-Azmal, the Bab's Book of Names, which talks about exactly how we can make people happy and not cause them grief. And I'm going to read to you this, is the words of the Bab. He said, be lovingly watchful of one another and thus improve your affairs. Even that's so remarkable. I thought if I want to improve my affairs, I should be concerned with me and my affairs. And he says, no, be watchful of everyone else, and that will how you improve your affairs. Should ye find amongst you one who is afflicted with grief, remove his sorrow by any means in your power. And should ye find one stricken with poverty, enrich him to the extent of your ability. And if ye find in your midst one who is abased, exalt him to the extent you can. And if ye find one who is veiled by ignorance, educate him to the degree of your capacity. And he goes on and on. He just lists every single way in which you comfort those that are sad, that are sorrowful, that are grieving. So this is clearly the most important virtue that we need to accomplish. How can you be happy? The first step to being happy is to understand that there are two kinds of happiness. I first figured this out when I read one of the hidden words, and I was quite sure that Baha'u'llah used the wrong word. I thought he made a mistake. And, being pedantic like I am, I felt obliged to correct the manifestation of God. Because he said in one of these hidden words, he said, should prosperity befall thee? And I'm saying, no, Baha'u'llah, befall is a verb that you apply to a bad thing. Befall is something, if something bad happens to you, that befalls you. But you're talking about prosperity here, and you're using the verb befall. And I'm thinking probably he didn't make a mistake. He was probably making a point by using that particular word. But he says, should prosperity befall thee, rejoice not. And should abasement come upon thee, grieve not. For both shall pass away and be no more. So he's telling us to do two things, and one is a lot harder than the other. The second one, when bad things, abasement and other bad things happen to you, don't be unhappy. Okay, maybe I can accept that. But when prosperity comes to you, to not rejoice, to not be happy, that's actually harder in a way, isn't it? It's a harder thing to do. And yet when I thought about it, I realized that if you rejoice in wealth, you're always going to be unhappy when it's taken away from you. If you enjoy attention, you're always going to be sad at the lack of it. If you enjoy praise, you're always going to be unhappy when you don't get it. If you enjoy comfort or you enjoy luxury, you're always going to be unhappy with it. So Baha'u'llah makes these two commands because he says, don't have the bad happiness because it will always lead to unhappiness. because you're placing your confidence in things that are going to be taken from you sooner or later. Another passage that I found in the writings that I was quite sure Baha'u'llah was using the wrong word. He says this, he says, "The true lover yearneth for tribulation, even as doth the rebel for forgiveness and the sinful for mercy." And I said, yearneth? Yearneth, Baha'u'llah? Are you sure? I mean, what do you yearn for? Okay, I mean, when you get up in the morning, you yearn for a good cup of coffee, or you yearn for some food. You know, what are all the things you yearn? But you come home from a hard day's work, and you're tired, and you say, "I really yearn for some tribulation." I mean, do you yearn for that? I'm thinking, Baha'u'llah, maybe the true lover begrudgingly accepteth tribulation. Okay, thank God I wasn't writing the hidden words, because that's what I would say. And so, clearly, Baha'u'llah has a different concept of how we should approach life. It's quite obvious to Baha'u'llah that we cannot control what happens to us in this life, but we can control how we respond to it. And so Baha'u'llah is telling us that this is the way to live. This is the way to live. Now, Abdu'l-Baha, he was able to find happiness because he saw in everything, whatever happened to him in life, no matter how terrible it might have seemed, he saw it as being a message from God. It was a message from God. And this was a very interesting thing that he told the Baha'is in Paris when he was there. He said, "I have been traveling for 2.5 years, and nowhere was I ill except here. Because of that, I had to stay a long time. Were it not for this illness, I would not have stayed in Paris more than a month." And so he continued to explain to the Baha'is in Paris why it is that he has this attitude towards whatever befalls him in life. He says, "It has been so from the early years of my life. The wisdom of whatever has happened to me has become apparent later. While I was a child in Tehran, 7 years of age, I contracted tuberculosis. There was no hope of recovery. Afterwards, the wisdom of this and the reason became evident. For were it not for that illness, I would have been in Mazar-e-Duran. But because of it, I remained in Tehran and was there when the Blessed Perfection was imprisoned. Thus I traveled to Iraq in his company." So, you see, this is what Abdu'l-Baha saw. He saw that you accept everything in life. You accept it, and the wisdom of it will become evident later. And through this means, you don't have this bad happiness, this happiness that's based on physical things. You have true happiness that's based on the fact that God is all bounteous, and whatever you get in life, that is the best thing that you could possibly get. I'm going to read you what Abdu'l-Baha said to those Baha'is in Paris, because I find it fascinating. He said, "In this world, we are influenced by two sentiments, joy and pain. Joy gives us wings. In times of joy, our strength is more vital, our intellect keener, and our understanding less clouded. We seem better able to cope with the world and to find our sphere of usefulness. But when sadness visits us, we become weak. Our strength leaves us. Our comprehension is dim, and our intelligence veiled." Isn't this interesting? That joy is far more than what we realize. It increases our abilities. It increases our intelligence. This is obviously why we read the writings with joy. We're going to understand them better. And he says the actualities of life elude our grasp. The eyes of our spirit fail to discover the sacred mysteries, and we become even as dead beings. And then he goes on to say where sadness comes from. He says, all the sorrow and the grief that exist come from the world of matter. The spiritual world bestows only joy. When our thoughts are filled with the bitterness of this world, let us turn our eyes to the sweetness of God's compassion, and He will send to us heavenly calm. If we are imprisoned in this material world, our spirit can soar into the heaven, and we shall be free indeed. I myself was in prison 40 years. 1 year alone would have been impossible to bear. Nobody survived that imprisonment more than a year. But thank God, during all those 40 years, I was supremely happy. Every day on waking, it was like hearing good tidings. And every night, infinite joy was mine. Spirituality was my comfort, and turning to God was my greatest joy. If this had not been so, do you think it would have been possible to have lived through those 40 years in prison? Thus, spirituality is the greatest of God's gifts, and life everlasting means turning to God. May you, one and all, increase daily in spirituality. May you be strengthened in all goodness. May you be helped more and more by the divine consolation. Be made free by the Holy Spirit of God. And may the power of the heavenly kingdom live and work among you. So I want you to remember that Abdu'l-Baha is a challenge to you to become a new race of human beings. Every time you read a story of Abdu'l-Baha, say, when is the last time I did that? Or could I do that? Or how can I do that? Abdu'l-Baha is a challenge to each and every one of us. It is not impossible for us to become like Abdu'l-Baha. I do not believe that he would have said he's the perfect exemplar and say, look at me, follow me, be as I am, and then he would snicker in the back and say, good luck to that, you guys. I just don't think that Abdu'l-Baha would do that. It would be so cruel of Abdu'l-Baha to do that. The point is that we're going to talk a lot about becoming like Abdu'l-Baha, and I don't want any of you to despair, because Abdu'l-Baha has said there is a way to your spiritual development, and the way is to not compare yourself to anybody. He says the only person you should compare yourself to is to yourself yesterday. All he said to do is every time you wake up in the morning, to think how you were yesterday and think how are you today. He says if you feel you're a little better in any of these qualities, he says then thank God for that and ask for an increase of it. And if you're not so good, he says then ask God for forgiveness. Either way, that's all I got to do. He said just beat yesterday. He said little by little, day by day. This is Abdu'l-Baha's divine method, and this is what we're going to do. So do not despair and say, well, I have to suddenly become like Abdu'l-Baha. Just, can I be a little more joyful and radiant today than I was yesterday? And thank God for that today. So this is a wonderful journey we're going to begin on, a journey towards 6 beautiful destinations, the 6 essential qualities of Abdu'l-Baha.